I think we can all agree that this morning was an incredibly thought-provoking and exciting session that really brought the whole level of planning for the future to another level. It was, I think, really extraordinary. And we can see we are certainly a very different city than we were 50 years ago, and we will be a far different city in the future. You could see from what our speakers said this morning that we will need to think of how we can have a stronger and much more diversified economy. We need to think of new ways to support opportunities to climb the socioeconomic ladder, the need for building resilience, and addressing the issues of climate change. We need to obviously continue to shape a city with the physical qualities and infrastructure that can help ensure a strong future. So this afternoon is both about the future of the city and zoning, the role zoning can play in meeting the needs of the future city. For each topic, we have invited some of the most forward-thinking planning and zoning experts in the country. These key decision makers have come from San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston, Denver, London, our own New York City, as well as our leading universities in the country, to present to you innovative ideas and their insights into how zoning can be used to address challenges. And I want to make sure that all of you know that we at City Planning and in the Bloomberg administration have a totally open door policy to criticizing, to saying what we haven't done enough, where we need to do more, and this should be a really open floor. Open the Pandora's box. Whatever you think of that has not been addressed and should be addressed, both now and in the future years to come. And I want to give also a heads up to our very exciting closing panel, and that we've assembled, after these 4 panels this afternoon, we've assembled an amazing group to discuss where we go from here and what ideas may be the most important to the city's future. This information we hear this afternoon will help us chart a course, not only for these next few years, but for future administrations to come. So, to begin this discussion, we will first focus on the competitive city and how zoning relates to the competitive city. And I'm thrilled to invite to the stage 2 leading figures in urban economic development. First, Vishaan Chakrabarty, who is the AIA Holliday Professor and Director, Center for Urban Real Estate, at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Vishaan, welcome. And Kairo Shen, who is the Chief Planner for the City of Boston. Kairo.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Gerald, Jack, for organizing this extraordinary conference. And I really want to compliment you on the design of the day in terms of the morning sort of queuing us up into an afternoon that really, I think, should be about what's next. We have seen the Bloomberg administration do extraordinary things. As a former administration member, I can certainly believe that we did extraordinary things, but I think we could certainly do more. So I'm from Columbia University, the Center for Urban Real Estate, and one of the primary things that we try to do is with our students look at what is the role of urban real estate, what role does it play in global urbanization, in architecture, in infrastructure, and so forth. Now, knowing Dan a little bit, I sort of figured that we would hear about the virtuous cycle. and I heard it quite a bit, which is, of course, this theory that the quality of life, right, is a function of the marginal revenue that's greater than the marginal cost of an additional individual to the city of New York, and that therefore competitiveness is a function of growth. And whereas I do very much believe that, right, I think at the same level we need to consider that urbanity has the potential to be that and much more. That essentially, not just in terms of economics, but the environment, as Rit spoke about, equity, as Roseanne spoke about, which are the three metrics that the UN has sort of set forth for us to all look at in terms of establishing human happiness. Right? That as I look at those, I believe that density in transportation, density in mass transit, represents the silver bullet in terms of the essential problems that we face as a nation and as a world today. This is why, poor Ben, but this is why I believe that Amanda and her successors, as well as the planning commissioners of the 10 major cities around the world, in many ways control more of the fate of the world and what will happen in our world than our fiscal policymakers, because they not only control value through upzonings and so forth, but they tremendously impact the environmental aspects of our city and the social aspects of our city. And the reason that's so important is I'm sure many of you heard all the hand-wringing that happened over the last couple of months about the 7 billionth baby being born in the planet. Us crazy Indians and Africans at it again. But the reality is that all 7 billion people in the world living at New York density, and I don't mean Manhattan density, I mean all 5 borough density, could fit in the state of Texas, with the rest of the world left over for agriculture and nature. When the world peaks out at 10 billion in 2100, that would mean Texas and New Mexico, so there'd be a blue state and a red state. But I asked this sort of fundamental question of whether population by itself is a crisis. We, however, are not heading towards that density as a planet, as a country, and even as a city or region. Plan YC, as great as it is, projects a growth rate for our city by 2030 of about 11%. If you look at the RPA's data, you'll see that the region is actually growing by almost double that amount. And so what we're really seeing is, for a whole variety of reasons having to do with affordability and school systems and so forth, we're building more sprawl than we are tall, despite our best efforts in this city. And this results in an extraordinary loss of productivity, right, for our city, for our region, for our nation. The Wall Street Journal reported last year that we lose about $8 billion in productivity annually to traffic congestion. That is, as a capitalized value, worth about $150 billion, would build a high-speed rail system down the mid-Atlantic. But of course, that high-speed rail system is being built by our counterparts in China, the fastest passenger train in the world that can make the trip from New York to Charlotte in about 3 hours. So you ask, what does all that have to do with zoning? Well, I think it's important to also understand not only that they are building that high-speed rail network, but that this is a station, right? That this is the Hong Kong ICC, which is in Kowloon and will connect Hong Kong up to Shenzhen and Guangzhou in the Pearl River Delta. I think we should be looking to this, and Alex, I'm sorry, wherever you are, I need to disagree with you about Paris a little bit. I don't think New York should be as concerned with museum cities. I think we need to be concerned with growth cities, and that's because that is fundamentally who we are. This is the train station in Nagoya, Japan. That is 15 stories of retail situated above the high-speed rail station. Japan, of course, one of the most environmentally sensitive countries in the world. So I wanted to come with 5 recommendations this afternoon The first being that we need to zone for a modern CBD. And we believe that we've been doing this, and Hudson Yards is certainly a great step in that direction. But I believe that if you look at the building obsolescence that's happening in our city today, that we need to zone for hyperdense buildings, probably 30+ FAR at our rail hubs. That we should begin with Park Avenue and Grand Central, which is now on its second generation of buildings and should start heading towards its third. And we need to do the careful math of what FAR does it mean to get to take down a tenanted 1950s office building in Park Avenue and replace it with a new state-of-the-art building. We have, when you get to the west side, we have traditionally done the opposite of planning density around rail hubs. And of course, we all bemoan the loss of Penn Station. But if one digs deeply, I don't think we're asking ourselves enough about why Penn Station was torn down. In fact, if you look at the book Conquering Gotham by Jill Jones, you'll read about a number of stories about potential towers that could have been added, architecturally questionable, would surely have saved the station. About the hand-wringing that went on about development around the station and the fact that Penn Central Railroad did not build the development parcels that New York Central Railroad did, which ultimately led to our being able to keep Grand Central, but our loss of Penn Station itself. And so as we talk about putting Amtrak in Foley, a project I've worked on for 7 years now, we should not lose sight of that lesson, right? That this is not just about the station, but the world around it. This is an image of something we pursued for many years together, the relocation of Madison Square Garden into the back of the Farley Building and a rebuilding of Penn Station proper. I would counter that this is the single biggest collective failure we have as a city in not seeing this happen. It's not going to happen now, and I think we still have to move forward on Moynihan and advancing the commuter station and Penn Station, and need to look carefully at the district around it to see how that district can aid the redevelopment of the station. Second recommendation, that we need to zone for dense and affordable housing and businesses along our subway lines, the city of cities. Now, Dan spoke about this extensively this morning, and we heard a lot about housing, and we are doing great things in terms of Hunters Point South and Villa Verde. I'm not even going to comment on architecture so much as just the point that we're building very significant affordable housing projects in our city. And I would say that we have to continue that trend along our major transit lines. So as we look at an area like Seward Park in the Lower East Side, I believe that this city should not spend $17 billion to build a full-length 2nd Avenue subway unless it comes concomitant with a major rezoning of the Lower East Side, including this area with significant new affordable housing. Similarly, Queens Boulevard, which has 4 subway lines running underneath it, should not look like this, right? Why should Queens Boulevard, with this subway access, have lower density than Chelsea? Why should Long Island City, which is 15 minutes from Midtown, again with 4 subway lines, have less density than Union Square? Now, of course, whenever I talk about this, people accuse me of being a lover of Blade Runner. I do love Blade Runner, but this notion that somehow that density and livability are at odds shows me that a person hasn't spent enough time in Tokyo, which is one of the most livable and one of the most dense cities in the world. And our zoning, the way we approach zoning could actually change in terms of arriving at livability, right? And getting to a mix of high and low buildings, new and old buildings, and as Jane Jacobs called for 50 years ago. And this is not all about upzonings. So our team at Columbia has been looking at the unused FAR in this city. And the numbers, and I had them triple check this because I was staggered by it the first time I saw it. The numbers are extraordinary. There is almost 4 billion square feet of unused FAR in this city. The majority of it is actually dead FAR, meaning that it's FAR that a landowner can neither redevelop nor can they sell. And this is at some level because of the way we do rezonings. And in fact, the rezoning that does not suffer from this is the very successful West Chelsea rezoning, the Highline rezoning, which I'm sure many of you have seen this diagram that was done by Jaime Ortiz and Jeff Mulligan at City Planning back in the day. And what it talks about is the transfer, the fluid transfer of air rights from the Highline over to Avenue sites. And I thought, well, what if you could do that but just without the Highline? That if you had an average block, if this was your typical zoning, where you had some density in the mid-block and more on the avenues, that why couldn't you keep that same amount of density, but then do something called a cap and trade, which allowed you essentially to distribute that FAR across a block, several blocks, a district. We can do this with landmarks, but why can't we do this in a more general matter? And a gentleman asked a question about small parcels and small parcel ownership, and I think what this would do is not just create the mixed-use city, which we've been talking about for 2 decades now, but the mixed-density city. And I think all of us as planners are guilty of this thing of like the low buildings, the medium-sized buildings, the tall buildings. You know, I'm relatively tall for an Indian, my wife is Greek, and she's kind of short. You know, you can mix things up. Right? You know, you don't have to have that kind of rigidity. And what it means is that for all these people who don't redevelop, that they still have an ability to monetize their air rights, which could mean an amazing amount for small businesses and for small landowners in this city. It could also give you, in my mind, a much more livable city. In the sense that I know London was arrived at it a different way, but this notion of the high-low city, of the way light and air penetrates, of the mix of buildings. And the reason Jacobs talked about the mix of old and new buildings wasn't for aesthetic reasons, but actually was for economic reasons. That she claimed that different uses could occur in a big office skyscraper versus a sort of rundown office building that might house more creative industries, for instance. The 5th recommendation, and I stayed away from the word sustainability, and I wanted to actually get a little bit more specific than that and talk about energy and waste, and not just green buildings, and to some degree water. So there are certainly things that we could do for green buildings. So for instance, I believe we should give a full FAR deduction for a double skin curtain wall. But that's just from new construction, and as any of you know, that's not enough to get us to where we need to be. I believe we need to start looking at not just parks, but performative parks, parks that give back to our city. If we're going to talk about building parks that are hundreds of acres, like on Staten Island, right, that there are ways in which those parks can perform for us, whether it's wind energy, or this is a diagram of something called a living machine, which is a chemical-free wastewater treatment plant, and that could be extraordinary in terms of delivering clean water. We also have to, I believe, bring waste to energy to this city, and that we should zone for it. We should stop relying on manufacturing because, as Dan said, we've actually rezoned most of the manufacturing, at least in Manhattan, and actually actively, proactively zone for our infrastructure. We have a big nuclear power plant that's sitting upriver for us. It provides 20 to 25% of our electricity. It needs to go. The only way it can go is we can figure out a different way to produce the electricity needs. And electricity, we talk about transit and density, but electricity is the biggest, the generation of electricity is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. So we really need to look at how can we do waste to energy, because we're spending $1 billion shipping our garbage out of New York City today, and we need to do this differently. Now the 5th, all of these ideas that I've talked about today are politically difficult ideas to achieve. I will give you that. And if growth is fundamentally politically difficult, then perhaps we need to look elsewhere for where we zone. And one of the things that I think is a tremendous possibility is our harbor, and what we can do with our harbor in terms of creating economic and environmental resilience. Amanda has called the harbor and the waterfront the 6th borough, and I think that's very appropriate. But I wonder how the 6th borough can help us as we look at this. Now, historically, of course, Manhattan has grown tremendously through landfill. 10% of the island is landfill today. Battery Park City, one of the most successful additions to our city in terms of providing new housing, was a fairly recent landfill addition. And so, of course, this is the way we've grown as a city. But it's not just about growth to create density. It's also about the fact that we are now in a very difficult situation in terms of resilience, because we have to address our vulnerability. This is a photograph of the Battery from Hurricane Irene. And this is an image done by Barbara Wilkes at W Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And she talked about using the dredge material in the harbor to create barrier islands and soft edges, which many landscape architects are talking about softening storm surge and allowing us to think differently about the edge of our city. So 4 students, and 2 of them are here, so be gentle as you criticize this, worked with Lori Hawkinson and myself in a joint studio up at Columbia. And they did incredible research, and they found that not only is the southern part of Governor's Island made of landfill from the Lexington Avenue construction, but that over time, this is the amount of acreage that's coming out of the harbor as we speak in terms of dredge material, right, because of the deep channels that we need to build in the harbor. And all of that dredge is ending up, by and large, in a landfill, largely in Texas. The proposal I'm about to show you is landfill the quantity of that yellow square. I want to show you that our competitors, and look at Hong Kong and Tokyo, what they are doing by comparison in terms of landfill. Right? And the fact is these are very environmentally sensitive cultures that we're looking at, and they're land constrained and we're politically land constrained. So what the students proposed is that as a first phase we need to change our public policy as it pertains to landfill. Then they start looking at transit connections and barrier islands. Sorry, let's switch here. And barrier islands coming down the harbor, protecting us from storm surge. Then they start actually building new development. And then in the final phase, by 2035, a zoning for a new district called Lolo that connects Lower Manhattan into this new area, preserving the historic district of Governor's Island. They use a tool called zoning information modeling, or parametric zoning, which ties three-dimensional zoning calculations to spreadsheets and other data to understand what the value of any given zoning proposal is. So they said, well, if you did this at 7 FAR, for instance, you could pay for a desalination plant that would provide water for this entire district, right? At 8.7, you could build Google's wind farm and power about 2 million homes on the Northeast Corridor, right? They looked at architecture in a very different way and looked at zoning bonuses in terms of getting elevated walkways for the eventuality that some of this new city may flood. And how can you deal with that in terms of resistance? The same way we looked at how do you resist an earthquake. And so ultimately, this is the plan that they came up with Lolo, retaining much of the existing park system that's being discussed today, retaining the navigable waterways, creating some 88 million square feet of new development, creating affordable housing, creating waste-to-energy plants, creating desalination, creating a subway extension of the number 6 and the number 1. And ultimately, this is the potential to build all of the recommendations that I've talked about here today in a place that is uniquely Manhattan. And after all, we can ask the boroughs to take on some of this, but at the end of the day, the boroughs have their own identity, and Manhattan has its own identity. And to that identity, I could say, what could be better than Manhattan than more Manhattan? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hard act to follow. Set up the Boston guy after the cool guy from New York. I'm sorry about that, but so if I seem boring, it's because he's very interesting. So I didn't know that Gerald gets such latitude about the content, but anyway, what I wanted to do actually was to talk a little bit about the way that we think about zoning today, which is primarily thinking about it as a regulatory tool, and really sort of expand this notion that it needs to be more than that if we're going to use it as a way of thinking about it as a competitive instrument, right? I think you heard a lot about instrument, thinking about that earlier on today. And I wanted to focus on 3 particular ideas. The first is thinking about how zoning might have a role in enhancing innovation and actually supporting places that generate ideas. So that's number 1. The second thing is to think about how zoning responds to the pressures from the market and from the changing global competition that's occurring, and talking about how we deal with agility and speed. And then finally, I want to talk just a little bit about how we, not necessarily we collectively, but New York or Boston or any city, or rather New York with the state of New York and Boston with the state of Massachusetts and other kinds of governmental structures need to be thought through again in order to achieve some of the things that I talk about. So the notion about innovation, I think you heard a lot about the virtuous cycle that Dr. Roth talked about this morning. But I would just say that there is a particular kind of people that we're all competing for, right? Yes, cities we need diversity, but we also need people who are innovators. And so one of the things that I want to propose here is the notion that cities are competing increasingly for young, smart people and smart businesses, because businesses derive from the people, and if we can attract and retain smart people, then we could do better. Now, a case in point is that Vishaan went to MIT, and Boston and Cambridge was not able to retain him. Being a transplant, of course, I ended up staying in Boston, and I would say that if I had come to Columbia for graduate school, I probably would be a New Yorker today. So the question is, how do we deal with this group of people? Right? So the first thing I want to talk about is innovation first. In Boston, we've been working on what we call an innovation district. In a sense, I want to get to a notion of innovation zoning. So here's a comparison. Wherever I go in the world, I always show the slide so that people know how we compare to New York. So you see Central Park, which is 850 acres of land. And many of you know that in Boston, we've spent about $5 billion cleaning up the harbor for the last 30 years. And if you remember the Bush #1 versus Dukakis election, you know that Boston Harbor played a very important sort of political role. And our planning, of course, not so different from New York, has been centered around reconnecting our downtown and our waterfront neighborhoods to a central cleaned harbor that can be the same kind of resource that Central Park is to your city. Now, the innovation district that we talked about is more or less the same size, about 800 acres, and it's formerly industrial land, 19th century warehouses and so on. And we've been planning it for a number of years, and we created a plan, and then what we discovered was that when the market crashed in 2008, 2007, that our notions of mixed use and our notions of letting the market determine the use all disappeared. The most financeable uses were the ones that first disappeared. So the Mayor Menino, really wanted us to think about how can we turn this district and get the right kinds of uses to produce the 21st century jobs and the 21st century businesses in Boston, building on our strengths, which is smart people that are generating ideas and generating startups. And those of you who heard, Mark Zuckerberg came to visit Boston just last week, and he told us when he left, he said, if Boston had what it has today in terms of the support for innovation, he probably would not have left. And he's coming back to recruit people who otherwise would stay in Boston because of what our city is today. So we were not the first to come up with this idea. 10 years ago, Barcelona, facing a similar kind of issue about how to reuse industrial land, came up with the Barcelona 22 Act. And the notion is this 1,500 acre, twice the size of Boston's innovation district. And they basically used upzoning the area from FAR 2 to 3 in order to transform and reinvest in all of these unused and derelict industrial property. And they also made a very important land use change from category A uses, which in Barcelona was industry, to play at uses, right, as in your email address at. And so the at uses were loosely defined as any non-polluting urban uses. And the notion was that they were losing jobs and people to the suburbs of Barcelona. And that in order to revitalize this area, keep those uses in the city, they created this zone. And I think, I don't want to boast for them. You can invite the Barcelona planner for that. But I would say that it's set a model for us in Boston. And so what we try to do, this is the Innovation District in South Boston, the downtown, Logan Airport would be over here, the new convention center, and you can see the 19th century warehouse structures as well as the Navy Yard. And all of this was rail yards, not unlike actually Hudson Yards in many respects. And we've been planning for it, but then the question was, you know, when we thought about what the right upzoning would be for the developers, we had to figure out what else can we do, embed in their permitting to ensure that we were getting the right way to incubate new businesses and to actually get the right kind of housing. So we built in what we called innovation housing requirement, as well as innovation requirement for non-residential uses, which broadly speaking, at least for this afternoon, we can think of it as a kind of innovation zoning, or I think of it as also startup zoning. So what does that entail? Some of it entails, obviously, you've heard earlier on, about that kind of infrastructure that's needed in any kind of this district to succeed. The physical infrastructure, and many of you, of course, know our Big Dig project, $15 billion worth of investment from the federal government to provide new transit to the area. And then I mentioned the industrial base, which is incredibly important because it provides different kinds of space. It allows us to think about manufacturing in a different way. And then the economic base that's already there, that there are Class A office spaces that are already in the innovation district. And the importance between that incubating and providing services for startup businesses. And then there is the heritage of the area, which, if you know, this was, unfortunately, the largest aggregation of artists in the New England area. And there's a sort of irreverence of thinking that goes on in that area that we wanted to build upon. Now, so, in some respects, what the innovation requirement is to think beyond what I think you've heard many times today, mixed-use zoning. What that is basically a table of uses that the developer and the market decides for you, right? I like to think that in the innovation requirement, we are actually asking developers to curate their uses. I don't want to think about this as a play of words, but in some respects, with the experience that we have and you have in your city, you know when certain uses beget more interaction between people and they generate interesting dynamic environments, which are the kind of innovation environments that I think we are seeking to create. There are pockets of those happening in your city, in many of our cities, and it's about sort of having the right physical form curated and designed, as well as the right kinds of uses. So going beyond the convention of mixed uses, the notion that institutions, the public realm, which has gotten a lot of play today, and then the diversity and mix of uses and the diversity of physical environment all contribute. But you have to sort of curate these uses in the right amount. So in Boston, for instance, we have the inclusionary requirement, which is 15%. But in this area, because we're particularly interested in attracting and keeping the young and smart people, we wanted to make sure that there's housing for them. They don't traditionally fall within the affordable, they don't qualify for the affordable housing, but they would prefer to live in smaller places. You heard this morning from Roseanne, the sort of restrictions within land use control about unit sizes, household sizes, that actually make these small units very difficult. So the notion here is that we're piloting, requiring the developer to produce another 15% of what we call innovation units, so micro units, and also designed around a kind of social structure. Our mayor calls it co-housing without the sort of socialist component to it, of course. That there's more shared spaces, and that sharing actually begets the generation of ideas. And then for non-commercial uses, the notion here is that the developer is required to bring 25% of their other uses that are actually what we deem innovation. Now, Here, I guess, for New York, you might be scared, but the innovation is the discretion of the agency. So you have to convince me and my colleagues that it's innovative. And so the notion that you will devote space to incubate businesses and so on is one of the things that we're looking for. We don't have a prescription because we're looking for ideas from the development community, but the development community is required to actually take our feedback. So how have we done? We've done pretty well. In the last 18 months, we've had 70 businesses come down here, and then we've created about 2,000 jobs that otherwise would be in Cambridge in 128 Route 128. Some of the most important things that you probably heard is the Vertex Pharmaceutical is building 1.2 million square foot in right here. And then there is a lot of startup companies that have aggregated around the Fort Point district that I'll speak a little bit more about. And then the other area is in the industrial area. So, second point that I want to make about innovation is that you have to say, as I mentioned earlier on, retain the smart young people. Now, I think most cities have a very non-aggressive, maybe that's not the right word, but a very good cordial relationship when it comes to zoning and permitting to their universities and research institutions. And I would say this, which is that they are an incredible asset. Universities now are increasingly part of the economic development strategy of any city. You saw this morning Mayor Bloomberg's initiative to invite the 10 universities to actually compete to build university campuses here for science and engineering. I think it's just the beginning of it. MIT moved its curriculum into the web. They're talking about satellite campuses. And I think we have to be really vigilant about that, because just like sports teams, universities are going to be mobile in the future. And if you can imagine Harvard in Manhattan for a moment, and we'll come back to that. I guess Harvard is already in Manhattan because there's so many of you here. But anyway, the notion here is that how we zone institutions is a very important question that I think the zoning code has to deal with. And the reason is because if you can't keep your universities and promote the growth of your university and promote the breaking down of barriers between the university and the city that hosts it, then we're not going to be able to compete. So the notion, the traditional notion of a town and gown politics cannot be the reality of this century. So here's a map of the institutional properties in Boston. You can see by we have 34 colleges and universities in the city itself, which is about 155,000 students, constantly renewing, right? I mean, you constantly have this opportunity to make them stay in the city. And the notion here is that it's a major part of the economy, and that we have special institutional zoning to manage their growth, which means that they're entitled. The entitlement comes from this master planning process, which is then translated into zoning. Here's the Harvard property. They purchased, in case you haven't heard, 300 acres in Boston. So their ownership of land is larger in Boston than it is in Cambridge.
Could you wrap it up?
Yeah.
We're running out of time.
And then we want to encourage them to, of course, diminish the barriers between the community and themselves. So second point is about quick zoning. So I'm going to do it quickly. So the notion here is going beyond flexibility, developing a process for just-in-time planning that allows us to do tailor-made zoning. And for us, it's in Boston, a quick alternative to seeking zoning relief through the variance process. But it also requires the city to have the infrastructure and capacity to do this kind of just-in-time planning. And I wanted to show some examples. The first one in Boston, of course, is the John Hancock Tower. And then subsequently, the most recent one is the development rights granted to the Christian Science Church, and then some development actually in the Innovation District. And then with that, it raised a question about the quickest way to adapt to the market is to have a set of building stock that can be responsive to the changing market needs, that's adaptable. So the notion is that we need to think about what I'm calling here adaptive zoning, so that building stock, typically, that are the 19th century warehouses that are built with a lot of generosity that can evolve and change over time, become the quickest way that we can respond to market needs. And the question is, how do you get zoning to make sure that we reinvest in these structures, allow some transformation, and also, in some cases, it raises the question about how we do this while there are the overlays of other controls, such as historic preservation, which you've heard about earlier on. So the last thing I would offer, just the third point, is that in order to do that, we have to break down the current way of thinking about jurisdictions. Zoning is a tool that needs to be more than regulatory. It needs to be function for an economic development purpose. And you have to think about how your governmental structures are organized. So I've already spoken about the notion that here, I think in this city, economic development is separate from planning, which is separate from your board of standards and so on. Maybe it's time to rethink how you can organize that structure better. And then, of course, I would leave you with the notion that in Boston, I report to the Chief Economic Development Officer. And the notion here is that we're one large family where planning and economic development are integrated. And the notion, I would say, that Singapore has taken that one step even further. The Urban Redevelopment Authority has also grabbed into its zoning and planning, disposition of land, auctioning of land. So the three thoughts: innovation, agility, and speed, and then finally, integrated governance. Thank you for your attention.
Like Rick Bell, I'm going to stay here. But before I start, some questions that I have for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I want to make a couple of comments. One is both of you are talking primarily about planning, and the zoning is secondary. The second is that, for everybody's information, Paris is the most dense city in the Western world, far denser than New York City. And third,
flag on the play.
And third, when we're talking about the public realm, we're not talking about buildings. We're talking about what people own. And that is the streets primarily, which some of you talked about, and others did earlier. It's the streets and the parks and the open space and the quality of that open space. You can have buildings 100 feet high on a great public realm. It doesn't matter. Now, my first question to you both is, since you both led with planning, can you rezone a city without making major public investments along with it?
You can. It's not particularly good, but I think that in some cases that, no, I mean, I think that at some point, you have to get to, it seems that the way that we operate in the public policy dialogue is that we have to get to crises. And so I don't think we may have to pursue a strategy whereby we have to create more urban crises in order for the federal government and the state government to come and actually help solve some of these infrastructure, because I think New York and Boston don't control our destiny in terms of transit investments, right? I think that that's a state level investment, certainly in Massachusetts. I actually asked today whether there are any state officials that were here on this conference, because shouldn't the zoning of the city matter to the state officials, which are clearly controlling so much of the investment of infrastructure, as well as special districts and economic development districts in your city?
Well, actually, the city transit system is run locally and largely out of local funds. It's not dependent on it. But leaving that as
controls it.
And that we have a port authority that operates outside of jurisdictions of the federal government or the local government. We have other forms that deal with it, but it gets back to the issue. We have been trying in this country to do things on the cheap, to use zoning to replace government investment. So I'm going to get back to you, because you had the most massive government investment, Vishaan, that was supposed to go along with the expansion of the city. How do we get this public investment to go along with the zoning?
Look, you're right in the sense that if you look at the number 7 line, clearly, you know, Dan and everyone around Dan basically understood that there was no way that extension was going to get funded by the federal government, and so you had to use zoning as a means to finance it. Clearly,
And the High Line as well.
right, and clearly Hong Kong and Singapore have a huge advantage over us because they're city-states, they don't have this home rule problem, and so they can directly invest their tax revenues in a way that the city of New York can't. And so you do have to use zoning to figure out how to fund improvements, and that is the state that we live in today. It doesn't mean that that should be the way it always will be, and I think that, look, in terms of the slides I showed, I basically believe in the market, and that right now we have our fingers on the scale of the marketplace tilted towards suburbanization, whether it's the federal home mortgage deduction, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the way we privilege highway funding over mass transit funding. If those things were all equalized, you would see Americans urbanize very quickly. And you would then start to see changes in governance and how infrastructure got invested in. But right now, that's not the state of play.
Both of you talked about the waterfront, and both of you had waterfront projects you were talking about. How would you go about altering the zoning for the rest of the waterfront? Because if we are to avoid what happened to congestion pricing by focusing only on one small part of the city, we're bound to fail. So what do we do when we're dealing with the entire waterfront, which both cities have a great deal of?
What we've been trying to think of, I think it's not so different from Amanda's idea of thinking about the water as a sixth borough. So the question is actually how do we control and use this, the lack of actually any zoning on the water, and we use the word, I think it actually doesn't make sense, water sheet, right? It suggests that it's just the surface. But the notion that there is volume out there and there's space, and clearly we have to figure out how to do it. We're not doing it yet. But I'm not sure it actually gets to what you're trying to get at, which is how does it affect the balance of development or growth in other parts of the city? I don't know. We're not seeing the waterfront as anything. The first slide that I showed, we're just trying to claim it as a kind of open space resource that can support more development around it, the same way I think Central Park is that kind of resource that allows the density around it and community to succeed.
Well, look, today we have waterfront zoning. Obviously, I'm suggesting a modification to that. But I don't think the issue is whether one modifies it at the local level. We have issues we have state regulations that prohibit us from doing any form of landfill whatsoever. It's antithetical to the history of New York City, and I don't believe it's the best thing to do for our environment.
Well, maybe you would argue, as I would, as a matter of fact, that we ought to re-examine the regulations that prevent further landfill.
We absolutely should, because if we are politically constrained to grow out into the boroughs, we have, look, Hudson Yards just had Coach's big announcement. Hudson Yards is going to happen. The World Trade Center is clearly going to happen. Between those two projects, there are 8 office buildings. Right? We need to plan for our next generation of growth, and if we're literally politically constrained to move out across the water, then maybe we need to move into it.
You talked in your proposal about cap and trade, and that is an innovative idea. Could you explain how it would work, and how far can the trade go before it intrudes into an area that's serviced by an infrastructure that can't handle it?
I think that's the critical question, and I think look, as you mentioned in your talk, we have special districts all the time. They're often formed around transit hubs. So one can imagine, for instance, the transit hub around Long Island City, where you could do an upzoning, but you allow the cap and trade to happen. I mean, Dan mentioned this half-mile marker. I don't know if it's that wide, but you could create a special district that was transit-oriented. But then you could allow what essentially happens with the zoning lot merger today, but just far beyond simply adjacent properties, and let property owners create a market for their area rights that creates this diversity of the city. And I really believe that this would do a tremendous amount for smaller business, for not official affordable housing, but unofficial affordable housing, because an entity that owns, say, a 6-story building, right, with cheaper apartments could then, monetize their air rights and do improvements that they needed to do and so forth without redevelopment. And I think that could be a very powerful thing in terms of keeping housing stock as well as letting new development to occur in a more surgical way.
You talked about zoning to promote innovation. In our city, the lead change in zoning began with artists in Soho as innovation. How would you change the zoning in order to encourage small property owners? And there was a gentleman here before, right there, who asked about 25-footers, and I would add owners of smaller buildings that are once were used for manufacturing to be innovative and change their land uses. And how would you change the zoning to make that easy?
It's clearly an issue that I think we have to address. I think the question, in our case, we were able to leverage this innovation zoning through added development rights to a large property owner. So
but these are small property owners.
I know that. I was just going to say that I just want to make sure that I'm not saying that we've got a solution that we've been working on that works for the small property. But the last set of slides showing about where some of these buildings, such as the former industrial structures, warehouses, the way they're being used, I think that we have to think about how we adjust the zoning so to allow the kind of reinvestment in even small properties like that to make them more viable. Now, does it mean addition? It means us thinking about what are the constraints of zoning on those kinds of properties. And I could only say from my experience in Boston is that we have historic constraints, we have other kinds of jurisdictions that go into that. There's some of the other concerns that other speakers have raised, which is community compatibility and so on. I think all of those, it's in the sort of nitty-gritty of the kinds of zoning regulations that are part, that a small property owner has to do.
We ought to open it up to some of the audience. Do we have microphones? Okay. Any questions for either of our two speakers? Raise your hands. I know that they were very, we have one up front.
Yeah, there's words being used continually, and I'm kind of curious if there's an agreement. The very basic words
Speak louder.
like space. And I suspect maybe there's quite a difference of what you mean by that. And I'm thinking of, we saw Hugh Ferris earlier, and the power of an idea that takes place over preceding a zoning envelope, right? And I'm thinking of certain people like the Deleuze or somebody that talks about space as being simultaneous, mental. That's quite different than I'm going to ask these two gentlemen. Is there an agreement? As I would have said, the terms are in question right now. It's an amazing time in history where the terms of everything connected to an urban environment are in fact in question, right? Whether it's global, whether it's multicultural, right? Question.
You're the guest, so I'm going to let you answer first.
To be honest, I don't quite understand your question. I'm not that smart.
Space you're on a plane today. It's simultaneous. It's mental. Does a space mean anything what it used to mean in terms of its cultural meaning? The place you own, you set ownership. Does that even mean anything anymore? Especially in a city like New York, or a Shanghai, or a Sao Paulo.
You want to answer it? Because if not, I will. Go ahead. There's a difference between space and place. Architects largely look at space as something they can move around. A place is a place that's used by people actively and by people who don't own it, by and large. People who go to Grand Central Terminal run through it at breakneck speed. And what we can do is to create places that are better or worse depending on how we manage that public realm. I think it's the point that some people missed when I was showing Paris at the end. The buildings in Paris are not very good individually. What's great is the Boulevard des Italiens. And the question is, how do you create what Paul Goldberger called earlier today the template? And New York has that template. We can build up 100 stories if we want, or not. But what we do need to do is have a great street. Somebody in the audience stopped me and said, that was Columbus Avenue, I thought. Well, that's the point.
Let me take it a little bit differently. Rem talked about when you break space, when you get in an elevator, it's the first time in human history where space is broken, right? And this notion that therefore, and it's kind of the same thing with an airplane where space is completely broken. So we live in this more fluid time, clearly, right? I think that's incredibly rich. And so that it's not clear to me that the divisions we use between public and private space, if you look at the High Line, for instance, the High Line broke every rule of good planning when it came along. We weren't supposed to build elevated spaces and all of these things, and yet look at the extraordinary success it is. It's continually sort of voyeuristic in terms of its relationship to private buildings and so forth. So I think all of that is fluid and dynamic, as you say, and the proposal that we put together on Lolo, I think tries to take advantage of that, to its fullest. And if you look deeply into that architectural drawing, you'll see a space that has incredible sort of fluidity and does not, in any way kind of give you a clue as to what's public and what's private and so forth. And that's what I think is exciting about it. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think that zoning does have a role to play in this very clearly in terms of the fluidity that you're talking about.
We're out of time, but our guest still has something he wants to say.
No, I was only kidding, but part of the question about space is that I think the question is that I think what this particular panel is focusing on how a domain that's not traditionally thought of as part of zoning's domain, right? Economic competitiveness. What is some of the elements in zoning that we can bring to bear that makes it an economic development and a competitive tool? I think it relates to your question about space in this way, which I think other people will cover. And for a moment, just indulge me. The smart and young people, when they choose to go to college, are choosing for all kinds of reasons, and they choose, if they have a good experience, presumably in the cities, to stay and make their home and make these centers, cities, vibrant centers. That, to me, can be affected by zoning in how you treat your universities, a point that I didn't perhaps have enough time to make. It affects how we treat the kinds of housing stock that would attract and keep those people in our cities. Now, I think, but the decision-making is not so isolated about one thing. It is the holistic view, which hopefully by the end of the day, when we hear the other panelists, we'll have a better idea of putting all of these things together. So I don't want to, I feel a little bit uncomfortable because I'm not usually an advocate for economic development in the city of Boston. I'm the planner. I'm not the economic development officer. But I think I see the value in thinking more broadly about zoning as an instrument. It's not just an instrument that plays in a particular set of octaves. We have to stretch it, and stretch it in such a way that it's going to work, and we may play music and notes that we have not expected from this instrument. And I think it's up to us to figure out how to stretch this instrument.
We thank our panelists.
Thank you.
So let's, without further ado, move to our second of four panels. As you can see, we're doing mirror images of the last panel for the morning, where we had people addressing the competitive city, the equitable city, the sustainable city, and finally the physical city. And now we're talking about zoning and the competitive city, or here, zoning and the equitable city. So I'd like to call up our two panelists for this next 45-minute session, which is supposed to be 15 minutes each of presentation, one question from the moderator, and open to the floor. So I'd like to call up Tony Griffin and John Ram. Why don't you both come up, both guys. Tony Griffin is professor and director of the J. Max Bond Center at the Spitzer School of Architecture, City College of New York, CUNY, and recently from Harvard. We lost her to New York, but it's New York's gain. John Ram, Director of Planning, City and County of San Francisco, formerly same thing in Seattle. So this is a terrific panel, and let me introduce Tony, and you begin. 15 minutes.
And Gerald's really strict about time, I know. We've come to the point in the program where what you hear may have no impact on New York. At least as an outsider, I'm hearing the conversation about New York, which feels very Manhattan-centric to me. And I'm curious about the dialogue of zoning in the other parts of New York, which are very different and probably more analogous to other cities across the country that have a core downtown and then residential communities around it. So I've been asked, and I think Mayor Cory Booker would be very proud to thank the organizers of this event for being so audacious to think that Newark, New Jersey, would have anything to share learnings from for Manhattan. So we'll just see about that. And so this conversation, I want to thank Roseanne Haggerty, who's no longer here, I don't think, because I thought I was going to be the first person to reference the word neighborhood, and in fact she did that. And so my 15 minutes is about zoning and the equitable neighborhood, which, by the way, let me just put out there, I don't actually believe, or at least I'm going to posit, that zoning actually does produce an equitable city or an equitable neighborhood, certainly not in and of itself. It is a tool, a rule, a regulation. And unless it incents someone to act, invest, build, start a business, it is just that. And in a down market city, unlike Manhattan, which is a very successful market condition, the way that rule has to be activated has to be done with a combination of other tools in order to make it effective. So I'm going to talk about our downtown, which again, put yourself in the mindset of the urban boroughs and their urban cores and the residential neighborhoods around them. We did, with the help of Skip Moraines and Maryland, New York office, a living downtown plan. Downtown Newark has no residential environment, but we do have two major regional transit hubs, Penn Station and Broad Street Station. And so as we were looking at bringing in sports teams, and we've got this great cultural venue in the middle of our downtown, we, like many other cities across the country, were beginning to think about how to leverage these regional assets and begin to create a more dynamic downtown. As Vijan talked about the growth of the region, we were also looking at the benefits and values of how Newark, New Jersey was going to get its fair share of that regional growth, and we were projecting about 25,000 residents between now and 2030, but also maintaining that as the 8th densest city in the country, retaining our current residents was also a priority. So this is going to look at the edge neighborhood around Broad Street Station, and what I'll call for now equity strategies, the combination of tools that we had to use with zoning, we felt that would help to contribute towards an equitable city. No longer being a planning official, it's interesting for me to step back and critique myself on whether or not these strategies actually work, and perhaps we can talk about it in the discussion. But we're going to talk about it through public land, public process, identity, housing choice, active streets, and mobility, and the different types of strategies we used. And what we created was a redevelopment plan, which was effectively an overlay planning document or tool to our underlying zoning code. So equity and public land. This is a neighborhood that had several public institutional partners. One of them was the New Jersey Institute of Technology, who was looking to do their own campus expansion. Some of that was institutional use, some of that was amenities for the surrounding community. We have the state's largest and most prolific collection of art in the state, the Newark Museum, that was also looking to do an expansion. We had another kind of institutional partner in the Public Housing Authority that owned a substantial amount of land, 200 units in 1930 four-story brick buildings. They were looking to demolish that property and build new housing at a very limited, with a very limited housing typology. They were not looking, in fact, to create more density. And Rutgers University was relocating their business school right at the front door of the train station. What we realized, and so our first point around equity and public land, was that we realized that we had 4 or 5 institutional partners, including the city of Newark, that had public land holdings. And in fact, if all of us came together collaboratively to think about this as a portfolio of land that could be partnered with the public sector for development, not just of those institutional needs, but other broader needs in a neighborhood, and that we weren't looking at working as individual silos, that in fact we all might see better economic upside and a more responsive market. So as we were doing the planning process, we actually put out a request for expressions of interest to test our planning theories and zoning with the market. Equity and public process. I think zoning doesn't work if you don't do it in the context of a larger planning discussion and that it's done inclusively. So building towards an equitable neighborhood or an equitable city actually has to include and think about the voices that are actually planning in real time, not planning over here and then going out for public comment, but at the table with you at the real time. When we did this planning effort, we hosted over 30 meetings. We had specific meetings with different types of stakeholders, property owners, different from institutional partners, different from residents, different from commuters, and we developed a documentation process that allowed people to see how that input was being moved forward in the plan. We were able to record and understand, as we did the plan, the neighborhood objectives that we wanted to meet in addition to those institutional partner objectives that we wanted to meet. In the end, came up with an inclusive and consensus set of objectives that all parties, the institutional partners and the community partners, agreed to. It had to do with how we looked at place, different from space very differently, and maintaining the integrity of that, how we were protecting historic assets and retaining local residents, while at the same time meeting some of our larger citywide goals related to revenue generation and economic development, and being at this extraordinary regional transit asset that we did need to increase retail, we did need to increase housing, and we did need to increase our employment base. Equity and identity speaks to another strategy which had to be place-based. We wanted to make sure, in this case, our zoning was actually somewhat surgical, and it was built around the understanding of particular assets that were embedded in this neighborhood, from the museum to the historic Washington Park, to historic churches, the first and oldest historic church in the city, and how those were going to be clues and indicators to how we looked at the underlying frameworks. With that, we created and began to use zoning districts. I know we've had already some conversation around how rigid and prescriptive those needed to be, but because there were so many existing assets in this community, it was important not to blanket the whole neighborhood with a single zoning framework, but to think more discreetly about the different districts that were embedded within this larger neighborhood. So for example, in the historic James Street district, it was important to us because Newark has cumulative zoning and that someone can come in here and build a single-family detached house, that we did need to be fairly prescriptive, that you had to build a structure that was attached and could be at a minimum no less than 30 feet. Equity and housing choice had to deal with the fact that density actually was important to us. And while we couldn't be so much like Vajan wants you to be in Manhattan, because we were a depressed market, we had to be very strategic about where absorption was likely to occur and how to regulate that through density so that we were getting the type of investment that we wanted in the areas we wanted. And obviously it makes sense to have a higher density zone near your transit hub, your regional transit hub in particular, versus other areas of the city. It was also important to us in this dialogue because in Newark, and maybe like some of the other boroughs of Manhattan, density is a dirty word and people don't know how to distinguish density and height. And so we had to create conversations, and Armando Carbonell is here, so he might recognize these images from his document from the Lincoln Land Institute of educating people around different housing typologies can actually yield higher numbers of density than you might think, and that these are in fact not so unfamiliar to the context of Newark. So again, we looked at within our zoning districts of looking at where we were going to create some minimums and maximums in terms of creating the types of densities that was most aligned with, again, some of the assets in the neighborhood and taking advantage of its location near transit. And so here, right at the base of Broad Street, we looked at, again, some minimum heights of development with unlimited height on the maximum end. We also thought of looking at active streets. There's been a lot of conversation of folks talking about zoning for the public realm, and we actually thought that that was important as well. And so we wanted to be, again, fairly surgical around the different ways with which you create the active street as a volume and not a two-dimensional surface, which has to do obviously with how the space is designed, but also how it's programmed. And so we began to look at the viability, and again, we did this in combination with the request for expression of interest with the development community of where retail and what types of retail were most likely to be successful as a business and as a renter, given the street pattern, the street dynamic, its proximity to the institutions and to the train station. It was also important for us to look at equity through access and breaking down some of the super blocks that were created by the historic housing sites and creating more ability for people to move safely through the neighborhood unencumbered by large buildings in their path. Someone said that zoning is not just a rule and all of a sudden people act the way you want them to. That's certainly the case in Newark, which is still a fairly highly auto-oriented culture. And so moving people to the notion that transit is a more sustainable way of living is actually going to take some time. And so while our initial instinct as planners was to really reduce and almost restrict parking as the transit station, which you would want to do, we had to recognize that that was going to take time, and we started to reduce the parking requirements and also be a little bit more prescriptive around where they could occur. We went through a whole equation, again, of looking at both minimums and maximums for different uses. And we also went so far as, because we knew that structured parking was still going to be a part of our life, how guidelines of how the skin of these parking structures and their ground floor programming were to be treated if they were to be allowed. And then lastly, equity through the public realm in its very simplistic terms was looking at the access for open space, which in this community was fairly deficient of. And this is, again, a place where we used our public land as one of the important tools as an investment strategy towards creating that type of benefit, creating that type of program that the community said was important to the life of the neighborhood. And so the couple of quick lessons here, and I'm just realizing that I've got lots of ones and twos, that is that, again, it's not, which may be subconscious around how I value them, I'm not sure, that we don't think zoning is in and of itself produces equitable places, that for us, particularly in environments like Newark, and again, this may be analogous to other parts of Manhattan, it has to be a series of tools and interventions and strategies that are deployed simultaneously. We thought it was extremely important that zoning be done in the context of a comprehensive neighborhood planning process that was inclusive of all the stakeholders that were there in real time. We thought that the use of public land and thinking strategically about how we were going to deploy that as a part of the larger public benefit strategy had to be done simultaneously. We used then the zoning to enhance and leverage the neighborhood assets that were there and complement them. So we have this great Washington Square Park. We wanted to make sure the zoning could be done to incentivize use and building form that would further activate this important historic asset. We looked at a combination of things that were form-based, so slightly looser on use, and land use strategy tactics to balance this notion of these institution and residential partners that had to coexist next to one another, sometimes right across the street. And it was also important for us to, not on the back end, but as a part of the process, have a very direct conversation with the development community by asking them to almost test and review the draft guidelines we were producing to see if they could be market aligned with some of what the community needed, and on the other side of that, that the community could be informed about understanding the realities and the economics of development towards achieving some of the programmatic items that they wanted in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm starting out with 2 strikes against me. I do not have a PowerPoint, and I'm not wearing a tie. So if you can forgive those 2 transgressions for speaking in New York City, I will move on. Thank you, Gerald and Amanda and Jack, for inviting me to be here in the San Francisco of the East. It's very good to be here. And I'm honored to be part of this panel, which is really quite impressive. Gerald asked me to kind of get into the weeds a little bit and talk about some ideas for very specific zoning mechanisms to address issues of equity in our cities. And I would like to do that, and I'll talk about kind of 4 concepts that West Coast cities have used in this regard, but I will start with a very strong word of caution and end with a very strong word of caution when I present these ideas, because they have a lot of unintended consequences. My first word of caution is really a result of me coming to you from the socialist state of San Francisco, or as our former mayor said, 47 square miles surrounded by reality. In San Francisco and in other places, there is, of course, often a great demand to use zoning to address a broad array of social issues. So public meetings are often fraught with people demanding that we change zoning, and it will improve their daily lives, and it will improve their economy, and it will improve everything about their lives. And it's largely because zoning, I think perhaps more than any other type of public process, provides a venue for that input. And I think that's true. But to paraphrase my friend Jim Duncan, who was former planning director in Austin, Texas, and is a planning consultant, we will not achieve world peace through better zoning. I repeat, we will not achieve world peace through better zoning. And you've heard this theme many times today. Zoning is one tool of many to achieve what we're after. And it is, I would go farther and say zoning is actually a very blunt instrument. It's a very blunt tool in our toolbox. And there are much more refined mechanisms in city government to get at the nuts and bolts of what we want. Having said all that, let me go over these four concepts. And I will say that in San Francisco, we've tried all of these in some form or another. Many of these concepts have been used in many other West Coast cities in some form or another, and particularly in California cities, and I will say particularly in smaller California cities, where we do attempt to control every brick and cornice and shape of window in what we do. So, having said all that, the four concepts are these. I'll just run through them quickly. One is mandatory inclusionary zoning and linkage. In other words, directly requiring contributions by private developers, whether outside of the incentive process. Number two, zoning related to retaining small businesses. Number three, restrictions on the demolition of existing housing. And number four is industrial, for lack of a better term, industrial sanctuary zoning. So mandatory inclusionary zoning is used often on the West Coast to require below market rate units outright of any development, no matter where it's built, and no matter, in many places, how big it is. In San Francisco, for example, 5 units or more require 15% below market rate. And if we have recently upzoned property, it's more than the 15%. There are many ways to achieve this. There are, both in San Francisco and Seattle and other cities, it's possible to build the units on site as part of your project. It's possible to do a payment in lieu of to the city's housing office to provide that housing elsewhere. It's possible, and many developers have taken advantage of this, to actually build those units off-site within, I think, a mile of the actual project. And then, of course, with commercial development, there is what's known as the linkage programs, where commercial development is required to fund the construction of affordable housing through a direct payment that is determined by the city at the time of the development. So mandatory zoning goes beyond incentive zoning in that it is actually a requirement of any development, no matter if it's mandatory inclusionary, I should say, is required of any development, whether you are getting an upzoning, whether you are getting an incentive or not. And it is actually being used more and more in California. The second issue has to do with small business retention. And here I'm going to talk about a concept that when I first got to San Francisco, I was relatively shocked and surprised at the extent of this program. But it's the program to retain small retail businesses through a control on what we call formula retail. Now, formula retail in our parlance is any store which has more than 10 locations nationally. So obviously that applies to McDonald's and Burger King and Starbucks and all of those, but it also applies, and this is perhaps the downside, to stores that are locally based stores that happen to have 12 outlets. And the controls range from outright banning those stores in certain parts of the cities to requiring a special review process for those businesses. I will say that in spite of my early skepticism of this mechanism, it actually has led to the allowance of more mom and pop businesses in our neighborhood commercial districts, and it actually has kept rents down in those districts relative to places that do not have those controls. Now, there are all sorts of downsides and market manipulation that we're talking about, but remember that I'm coming from the socialist state where we live. Another business retention tool that I think is less frequently used, and I'm not familiar with the exact mechanisms of how this was worked, but it's essentially the retail version of the inclusionary housing requirement, which is a requirement to hold down rents in retail spaces in new development to allow for local businesses to come into those locations. There have been projects I know of in Seattle that have done this voluntarily, and the result is actually the creation and growth of small businesses, particularly small food-related businesses that otherwise would not have been able to get into that market. As we all know, small businesses and local businesses have a very hard time affording rents in new development. This program would allow those businesses to go into new space in places that they would otherwise not be able to go into. And I think it would be worth exploring the technicalities of that in this venue. The third mechanism, as I mentioned earlier, is restrictions on demolition of existing housing, including SROs. Existing housing stock represents some of the most affordable housing that we know of in any city. There are many variations on such regulations. One just bans all demolition entirely. Another requires special approval of the demolition of any housing. And in San Francisco, we have a mechanism where an SRO can only be demolished if it's actually physically replaced. So if there have been several instances where SROs have been converted into tourist hotels, but the developers were actually required to build essentially a new or redo an existing SRO as a result of that. And I think this is a very simple, straightforward, and powerful tool. Again, we are talking about significant manipulation of market dynamics when we talk about these regulations, and I just want to be clear about that. And finally, industrial zoning. We talked a little bit about this earlier today, and I certainly agree with Dan Doctoroff that the type of manufacturing in cities has changed dramatically. The demand for industrial space has been reduced dramatically, but it does represent an important part of our economy. In Seattle, for example, the industrially based businesses still represent about 20% of the city's economy. In San Francisco, it's much less, and we are down to about 6% of the city's zone for industrial land, to the point where I'm concerned it's actually too small an amount. And the reason I say that is that we are now seeing a small but growing trend toward new micro manufacturing businesses. And it's primarily on clean tech and on food, right? San Francisco is a hotbed of food, of the food industry, and our restaurants and our other products. And it is very interesting to see these specialized industries coming into the city. They're actually manufacturing products. It's not just high-tech people sitting at computers. It's people who are employing local residents and actually manufacturing products in a very specialized, small-scale kind of way. But it does represent an interesting trend, I think, that we have to be cognizant of in the future. So let me just end with my second word of caution. It really is, don't regulate to a greater extent than what you need. Be very, very careful about unintended consequences with respect to these types of regulations. For example, as I was mentioning earlier with Formula Retail, there are many much-loved local businesses in San Francisco that have grown over the past 10 years and now find themselves branded as Formula Retail, who now have to go through a much more extensive process to open a store. There are unintended consequences of these kinds of regulations. And I think it's especially important to understand the economics, and there are two aspects to this. One, there is obviously a real cost to incorporating these types of regulations in any development. The numbers that have been run in San Francisco are as high as $100,000 to $150,000 per unit for new market rate development to incorporate many of these regulations into a development. That has, of course, a huge impact on the cost of housing over time for everyone. That's a very important consideration. The other unintended consequence, or perhaps consequence of implementing these kind of very detailed mechanisms, is the internal mechanisms that one must have within the planning department, the housing office, the economic development office to implement and actually monitor these effects. Right? The impacts of these require monitoring over time, require us to enforce these over time, making sure that someone doesn't have an affordable unit today that goes away in 5 years. All of those mechanisms have to be built into city government to make these things happen. So there is a very strong word of caution I have about making sure that you go into these types of mechanisms, these very detailed, fairly controlling type of mechanisms with your eyes wide open. But done correctly, I think these tools, as blunt as they are in many ways, can in fact achieve some of the social equity that we're all looking for in the equitable city. Thank you.
Is my mic on? Is it on? Okay, great. So John, I couldn't help but hear in your remarks somehow, even though you are the planning director of San Francisco and you preside over this mandatory system, a mandatory system, not inclusionary housing as practiced in New York with density bonuses and market growth that pays for the affordable. This is mandate through inclusionary zoning, and it's mandate through linkage. I know that people in this audience will be very enthusiastic about the idea of asking office developers to pay for affordable housing as a condition for development. Of course, I'm speaking not to everybody in this audience. Am I hearing correctly that you are backing away from that, even though that's what you have to administer? You are the planning director, you've got your zoning resolution. But I hear actually deep reservations about this, as if you might actually, if you could, wipe some of these things off the books. Sorry to put you on the spot, but you are here in New York.
Is there anyone here from San Francisco?
Where's the San Francisco Chronicle reporter? Oh, they're not, okay.
So for purposes of this discussion, this is Las Vegas, right? No, I think that there's a kind of mixed response. Politically, once these types of regulations are in place, it's almost impossible to pull back from them. And I think we found that in New York. That's why you have the zoning resolution you have. That's why our zoning code, our planning code has grown by 800 pages in 6 years. We're now 2,200 or 2,300 pages of code. I can't understand 90% of it. It is pretty intense. Now, having said that,
how much can you not understand again? This is the second story in the San Francisco Chronicle, sorry.
So there is, I think, my word of caution is in being very careful about picking and choosing from these different mechanisms, because the challenge that many California cities have gotten into is simply layering them on top of each other. And it's not that there's anything wrong with any one of these mechanisms. I've actually become a fan of the formula retail requirements. It takes longer, it takes a long time to go through the process, but in fact, I think it's led to some of the great urban neighborhoods that we have in San Francisco. I really believe that has really helped. I would love to figure out a way to make the process go more smoothly and have less time for a small business who's paying rent for 6 months while they're going through this process, which is our challenge. But I actually do think some of these regs can really work. The challenge we have, as I said, is that there have been so many layers added over going back to the 1950s in San Francisco's case, that it does become very cumbersome and very costly for both the city and any developer.
Right. Now, Tony, you've worked in, of course, different environments than San Francisco. San Francisco is a growth environment. You could, in fact, if you were willing to have more growth, imagine an incentive zoning approach, but you can go so far as to just require existing markets to provide it. How terrific. Wouldn't it be nice if your work in Detroit, you could just demand affordable housing, or in Newark, demand it all, but you can't. I wonder in the mature kind of area, and yes, in New York we've got neighborhoods that are poor, but we can always link to the central business district or the place where money is produced, and that's in some ways what these inclusionary housing programs do. You know, they provide money from where the money is, potentially to the neighborhoods, but you can't necessarily do that if you don't have that growth area. I mean, is zoning finally really an impediment? I mean, is the answer there, as some people have proposed in the past, the notion of empowerment zones or enterprise zones, where you just strip away all regulation and just hope that there's some degree of development that will be good for people who need affordable housing or jobs?
No, I don't think we're talking about stripping away all regulation. I think in a case like Newark or Detroit, you're simply finding that zoning is not the problem to growth and revitalization. It has, in fact, almost nothing to do with it, unless it's just egregiously wrong that a use in some place is no longer valid. But on the other hand, we have to recognize, and I'll use Newark as the example, there are small-scale development and change happening in communities. As I said, Newark had a cumulative zoning code, and so what was happening as industrial uses or commercial uses were leaving, people were building single-family detached homes on formerly commercial corridors. That's a zoning problem that we allowed to happen. And within that envelope, which was typically a 25 or 30-foot by 100-foot lot, our zoning required that you have 1.5 cars per unit. So now, with no alley system, I've got a front yard is now an asphalt parking lot because I've got to sit 5 cars on a site that won't house them in an enclosed structure. So zoning was absolutely a problem at that scale. So that's where it did affect housing. And one of the things we did is we did a complete sweep and created a whole new set of infill zoning standards, which allowed for where the housing market was, which was at this smaller scale, pervasive throughout neighborhoods. To do that, one of the things we wanted to be cautious about, though, as an architect, that zoning was not too prescriptive on design innovation. Midway through doing that, we actually got about 14 architects, including Richard Meyer, who was born in Newark, to volunteer to test these out and tell us, how they were actually restricting creative design in market, so that perhaps this basic unit of housing could appeal to a broader demographic, thereby creating affordable housing for a Newarker, but also that college student who wanted to stay in Newark but was looking for a different, more funkier, loft-like housing. So with that, we were able to kind of look at unit size. We were able to look at how to treat parking. We were able to look at and integrate green technologies. And so that's where we landed on the housing question and looking at equity and choice at that scale. So zoning is still important.
Okay, thanks. So it's to the audience now. Please raise your hand there and microphone.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Yes, all right. This question is for Mr. Rahim. With your industrial sanctuaries, or as you've described them, have you been able to create space or new space where manufacturing is allowed, or is this, at this point, implementation simply preserving existing space?
It's mostly preserving existing space, but it is repurposing a lot of that space. The other thing we did is require within the what we call the planning code a link to the Office of Economic Development. It's not that we require businesses to get loans or to actually directly take advantage of their services, but we require a discussion to take place and encourage and actually, I'm losing the details a little bit here, but I actually think we require that there's a certain employment requirement that comes with the industrial business within certain neighborhoods. A requirement for employing people of certain income levels. And we do that by linking the planning code to the Office of Economic Development.
Right there.
Question for the same speaker. I'm just wondering, why stop with limiting the number of businesses that someone owns that wants to come in and do something? Why not actually regulate what they can sell? A store. Why allow a store to sell M&Ms, for example, versus a locally made candy? I mean, where do you stop in that process?
Well, we kind of do in an odd way. I mean, I come at this with a big word of caution on the kind of cumbersome nature of this bureaucracy, because it has become quite cumbersome. But again, there are good effects. So, as an example, there is a pet food store craze going on right now in San Francisco. There are literally more dogs in San Francisco than there are children, that's a fact. I didn't make that up. And so there are many pet food stores coming in, and there are pet food chain stores that want to locate in the city. And there is an outcry by the local pet food guys who don't want the stores coming in. And one of the factors that we actually do have to look at by code is the impact on local businesses and local businesses that are selling similar products. So in effect, that is a component of the regulations I'm talking about.
But if I could add, just chime in on that related to this topic, where I would think it'd be interesting, I'm just sort of thinking about some of the cities I've been working in lately, Newark and Detroit, and some of these more low-income communities, how many McDonald's and bodegas and chicken restaurants do I have to drive by before I find another food choice? So I think in those contexts, you know, the thing that you mentioned up there, but we're not focusing on, is the where. It's not like a blanket thing. You've probably looked at where this is not having a positive effect in communities, and you're trying to do something to think about the diversification of choice that people have in certain communities. So I think
That's true, actually.
it's a very controversial tool, but I think it is interesting and perhaps ties into the topic of this particular panel as one solution. Yeah.
Right here.
John, one of the things you mentioned was the concept of inclusionary zoning for businesses. And I've thought about that for a long time, and particularly in New York, we have affordable housing, but considering the job situation here, and in some areas, the unemployment rate is higher than the average of the city, and those areas which tend to be middle and lower middle income areas that are disproportionately affected by the layoffs in the public sector, like firefighters or teachers or police people, that may have a difficult time retraining to enter another job because they're so specifically trained for that. So a lot of, what I'm noticing is a lot of people have the desire to start their own businesses, and I've long thought if you have affordable housing, but you don't have a job, you can't afford it at any price, even if it's zero, because you have to pay for food, and then to get in you have to pay for electricity, that type of thing. So I was wondering if affordable housing these days should be kind of reworked or retooled to include some sort of inclusionary bonus for keeping the rents low for small businesses. Because part of the problem I see so many people trying to start their own businesses, and the odds are just against you, like all the money you have to put in for a lease, like the security deposit, you know, the just getting started, the administrative cost, that type of thing. So not only just keeping the rents low, but some sort of way of having the critical mass to aggregate support services for these small businesses.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this is one mechanism we don't employ in San Francisco right now, one of the few. But I do think that it's an interesting concept to explore. There are challenges. How do you determine what is a local business? How do you determine what business would be eligible for such low rents as opposed to others? How do you monitor it over time? All of those things have to be addressed. Having said all that, I think it's something absolutely worth exploring.
Right there. Right there.
Thanks. This is a question really for both panelists. New York City has had a somewhat tortured history of trying to tie together publicly supported development with various wage-type controls that include living wage requirements on public development projects, something that was tried in the City Council a little while back on a project, to things like prevailing wages on public, construction projects that have got public land or other public subsidies, exemptions for that for affordable housing. And they've had really various impacts on development. I just wonder if both of you could comment from your different perspectives on the wisdom of tying development issues to wage requirements.
Well, from Newark's perspective, it was very important because of our extremely high unemployment rate. And so using real estate development as an attempt to try to make an impact on that statistic, it was very important. On the other hand, it was extremely difficult to implement, even though I think the mayor at the time was having good relationships with the unions and trying to broker a proper stance on that link to the public land we were trying to develop. And so we were never really able, at least during my time, to test it out. From what I know from previous years, one of the other challenges was simply the mechanisms of enforcement within public agencies. To actually, it's one thing to sort of create the regulation and mandate it and sign on the dotted line, but the mechanisms that were created to actually follow through with the developers, there was much more work to be done on that too, because that's where previous projects were falling short.
Yeah, we've done the same thing, and especially in terms of publicly sponsored development projects, there's a prevailing wage requirement. I think it's been in place for a while, and my sense is that it generally works. We've gone a step farther recently, Amanda, plug your ears, where the city now requires that 50% of the construction employees on a publicly sponsored site are city residents.
Yeah.
That's been very controversial and hard to enforce.
Yeah, and we did that too. It's hard to. We've had ups and downs of success, but that's been on our books too.
We have time for one more quick question, which is a patient person over there.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you know the percentage of new developments that opt to do the payment in lieu of providing the affordable housing for the required inclusionary component, and if that payment has a requirement for the city to use it in proximity to that market rate development and within a certain time frame.
I don't have the exact numbers. What's happened is that over time, the higher end housing, particularly in the downtown area and along the waterfront, has chosen to either pay in lieu, in which case that money is used by the Mayor's Office of Housing to provide, generally to either help build new housing through a nonprofit or to do acquisition and rehab of existing housing, and that can happen anywhere in the city. Some developments, and there's one very large one underway right now of a 700 and some unit project that is actually building the below market rate units off-site, and if they choose to do that, it has to be built within a mile of the development site. There's only been, I think, 3 or 4 of those off-site projects built. The vast majority in the downtown, where most of the housing has been built in terms of sheer numbers, have chosen to do payment in lieu of. Outside of the downtown, most of the development, the units are built on site.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. So, according to my schedule, we now have a 10-minute coffee break. Please come right back here within 10 minutes. Thank you.